Not too long ago, my wife, more popularly known as the lady I live with, made the mistake of agreeing to be the subject of a series of informal experiments where she'd try out a handful of titles in order for me to see what games are like for those who don't spend much time playing them. Through these experiments, I've grown a better understanding of the challenges that come with learning the language of video games for the first time. A lot of barriers exist for those who are unfamiliar with typical game conventions and mechanics, as most titles are designed in a way that assumes players have a baseline understanding of how games work, making it a difficult hobby for new players to pick up. With that said, it's been observed by many of you that the titles I've had her play haven't been that beginner friendly. And yeah, that is a fair point. So I decided to continue her video game education and in turn mine by running another informal experiment, this time having her try out some of the games that I probably should have had her play in the first place. Ones less focused on fighting enemies and working through difficult platforming challenges, and more centered on relaxed gameplay that somewhat aligns with her actual interests. So I had her play 4 titles, all of which were roughly in the life sim genre, those being Stardew Valley, The Sims 4, Slime Rancher, and of course, Animal Crossing: New Horizons. I chose these games partly because they've been highly recommended by many of you as great entry points into gaming, and also because they share the core loop of gaining resources that are used to build up and customize the player's home base, which was an aspect my wife really enjoyed when she played Minecraft, so I figured these titles would give her a similar feeling. Ultimately, I wanted to see what about these games makes so many people consider them to be good entry points into gaming, while also examining ways in which they may fall short for new players. As usual, I watched on as a mostly quiet observer, only occasionally reminding her of mechanics that each game had already gone over, and sometimes cluing her in on things that the games never taught. So this is how it went. In general, she found it a lot easier to figure out how to interact with various things in these titles than in the ones before it. And when I asked her about it, she said it was because she knew how to do most of the things the games wanted her to do in real life. Where something like bouncing off of stuff with a shovel to reach higher places, or killing an enemy up close to get health drops only really happen in video games, things like doing yard work, building relationships, and paying debts are activities she's experienced in her own life, which made it easier for her to guess how to engage with those mechanics. So with fishing in Animal Crossing, while the game didn't explicitly tell her when to press the A button, she knew to wait until the fish pulled the bobber under the water instead of when it first nibbled, because she has fished before, and that's typically how it works. So she was able to use her real life knowledge to help her with the game. By having core gameplay mechanics center around simple and familiar activities, it made it easier for her to grasp the basics. On the other side of things, Slime Rancher, which centers around sucking up slimes with a vacuum gun, storing them in a corral, and then harvesting their excrement to sell for money, took a little longer for her to grasp. Obviously, I don't think inexperienced players should only limit themselves to titles that are reflections of real life, but I do think that for someone just starting out, it can be a good way to familiarize themselves with controls and moving around in a digital space without being overwhelmed with somewhat obscure concepts. Along with her just having a little more experience with games now, it also helped that none of these titles had all that much urgency to them. She had the time and space to figure things out without the threat of something killing her, for the most part at least.
Are you serious?
While failing to figure out a mechanic in a lot of games can lead to dying and losing a lot of progress, with these, that was less of a factor, so she figured out how to do things without as much frustration. That isn't to say that there was no frustration with figuring out controls and mechanics though, as these titles still fell victim to a lot of the same issues that exist in the other games she's played. The tutorial for The Sims 4 bombarded her with far too much information in a tiny window, and also had her engage with some of the most mundane aspects of the game. Inversely, Stardew Valley's tutorial was boiled down to this, leaving her with little direction. Slime Rancher gave a lot of useful tips early on, but they were on the far right side of the screen, and as she typically has tunnel vision for whatever is directly in front of her, she sometimes missed important information. And Animal Crossing, despite over-explaining nearly everything in the game, doesn't tell players certain bits of key information, the most important being how to sprint. As a side note, given that sprinting in previous Animal Crossing games caused the grass to fade away, I assumed it would do the same in this one, so I decided not to tell her that sprinting was even an option in order to keep our island looking pristine. I later learned that that is not a mechanic in New Horizons though, so. Whoops.
Really? Now you tell me that?
Well, I've talked a fair bit throughout this series about how unexplained mechanics like these can act as massive barriers to new players. During this experiment, I noticed a few instances where unexplained mechanics actually benefited my wife's experience. Like in Slime Rancher. One of the early challenges of the game is figuring out how to best store the various slimes. There aren't really prompts that explain the best practices though, so as my wife collected various slimes, she dropped them in corrals without much rhyme or reason. Her first attempt resulted in a mass slime escape, leading to an intense moment of panic and excitement as she tried to gather them all up before they got too far away. Had the game said exactly what would happen if she mixed slimes together or put too many of them in the same pen, she would have been more careful and missed out on an entertaining moment. What's great is that the mistake didn't have a massive consequence, and it taught her to be more careful, so it ended up being a much more interesting learning experience than a prompt ever could have been. If important information is not communicated to the player, there should always be a reason for it, aside from the assumption that they already know how it works. Really, the biggest barrier for inexperienced players is how games communicate information, and that isn't just tied to teaching them controls or mechanics. It's also about properly communicating to them why they should keep playing, and that is done by establishing something that has been pretty consistent throughout all the experiments is that my wife likes to have a specific goal to complete when she plays a game. On top of that, she also appreciates when there are multiple ways to complete that goal. Having a clear motivation is important for any player, but it is especially helpful for those who don't know enough about games to set their own goals. Of all the games she played for this experiment, Animal Crossing did the best job communicating its primary goals to her in a way that felt satisfying. She got a tent, accrued debt, then she was told she can earn miles and bells by accomplishing various tasks. So it was clear what she needed to do and why she needed to do it. With The Sims 4, Slime Rancher, and Stardew Valley, she was given more of an open-ended goal, that of building up her farm and her home. While all four of these games essentially have the player do the same thing, earn money to unlock new stuff, it was a lot easier for her to quantify her success in Animal Crossing by seeing how much she had left to pay on her debts. Due to the other titles not having as clear of benchmarks, she felt a bit directionless when playing them. Every activity in Animal Crossing had meaning to her because it was working towards paying off her home, but the activities in the other games didn't have that same sense of purpose because the goal was more nebulous. She knew the idea was to improve her farm, ranch, or home, but it was a little more difficult to find out where to start. To be honest, when watching her play Stardew Valley, I was shocked at how much she struggled to find purpose, because when I played, I had no issue with that. As I thought about it more though, I realized that before even starting the game, I had specific goals in mind, because it had been pitched to me as a spiritual successor to Harvest Moon, a series I had put countless hours into throughout my childhood. I knew what the major goals would be due to my understanding of and nostalgia for the series it was paying homage to, so finding motivation in Stardew Valley took no effort on my part. Obviously, as my wife didn't grow up with the same experience, she had nothing to pull from when jumping into it. I'm sure that not every inexperienced player will have trouble finding direction and setting their own objectives in games, but I do think it helps a lot when games set immediate objectives for players to start working towards. Eventually, I decided to tell her some of the major things she could do in each game, and once I did, she had an easier time getting into the core gameplay of most of the titles, with the exception of The Sims 4. She really loved the idea of building and designing an awesome house that we would never be able to afford in real life. However, the actual act of earning enough money to build the house she wanted to was tedious and boring. It consisted of her choosing jobs for our Sims and then sending them off to work for about 8 hours, leading to the game fast forwarding for a minute or so while she waited for us to get home. While in other games she earned money by engaging with core gameplay, in The Sims 4 she earned money through an absence of gameplay, creating dull downtime and no real connection between her actions and the reward. On top of that, the amount of money earned from one day of work in The Sims is pretty tiny, so in order for her to build the kind of house she wanted to, she would have had to play for a long time.
I made $136. Killing it!
In the hopes of avoiding the lives of our Sims becoming eerily accurate reflections of our own, we decided to speed up the process so that she could engage with the element of the game she found most interesting by, using cheat codes. Once she had a cool $9,999,999, The Sims 4 went from being a game she had been getting bored of quickly to one she spent nearly a dozen hours in designing houses. While I'm glad the game had a way for her to play in the way she wanted to, I couldn't help but think that this sort of thing should have just been a game mode instead of an option hidden behind a cheat code. Cheats are probably most useful to inexperienced players, but given their lack of knowledge about games, they're unlikely to know or assume that a title may have codes they could enter. Obviously, this isn't that prevalent of a problem, as cheat codes have largely vanished from games, but that actually leads to a bigger issue. A lot of titles don't offer enough options for players of all types. I think a lot of games would benefit from following the lead of titles like Celeste, which has an assist mode that allows players to adjust various game mechanics to suit their needs, while also making it clear that it isn't the intended way to play the game. When we talk about accessibility, it's often in relation to making a game less difficult, but I also think it's important to consider it from the perspective of making a game more interesting to certain players. This sort of thing doesn't work for every title out there, but for something like The Sims 4, which has two pretty distinct phases of the game, living and building, allowing for some sort of option that lets the player just focus on one of those things without having it tied to a cheat code would be nice. I found that people who play games often are far more willing to stick with a title they aren't entirely sold on than those who don't really play games. So it is massively important to provide inexperienced players with a reason to want to keep playing. And really only one of these games did that for my wife. So are casual titles the best way for new players to get into games? The answer is a definitive probably. These kinds of titles offer a relaxed environment for inexperienced players to get used to moving around in a digital space while learning the core concepts of a game. While my wife never felt the same levels of accomplishment that she did when completing certain tasks in more difficult games, she also didn't have to deal with the frustration that comes from continual failure. With that said, there are a lot of factors that go into choosing a good starting point for an inexperienced player that go beyond a title's gameplay. The most obvious being finding a game that fits their interests. In the first experiment, I threw my wife into a handful of titles with settings and stories that she had little to no interest in. My guess is that if someone has gone their entire life without really getting into video games, they're probably more likely to be interested in the settings and concepts that are prevalent in life sim titles. There's also a lot of reasons on the more technical side of things. As we've continued doing these experiments, I've noticed more and more that my wife gets pretty nauseous while playing first-person titles, and that became extremely apparent while playing Slime Rancher.
I just don't like these kinds of games.
What about it?
Yeah, because they're nauseating.
Simulation sickness is something a fair amount of people suffer from while playing first-person titles, and while it can affect anyone, people who play games regularly are less likely to be consistently bothered by it because they end up spending more time acclimating to that sort of stimulus. So despite Slime Rancher having a lot of qualities that make it an appealing game for new players, the mere fact that it is in a first-person perspective might be really difficult for an inexperienced player to adjust to without the proper aids. After some research and experimentation, I found that having her play in windowed mode with an unmoving image in the background helped a fair bit. In general though, first-person titles are probably a little riskier to start with than third-person ones. Beyond that, even just the way a game looked had a direct influence on her interest in it. Typically, she's found titles with a more retro art style to be less appealing than ones with more modern graphics. One of her major complaints about Stardew Valley was that she couldn't tell what things were. Pixel art is often a little abstract, meaning it calls for those looking at it to extrapolate meaning from blocky edges and a lack of detail. For people like me who grew up playing games with this sort of style, it's probably become second nature to do that. But that wasn't the case for my wife. Obviously, it wasn't impossible for her to figure out what certain things were supposed to be, but it wasn't always immediate either. So she preferred the games where she didn't need to think about that sort of thing at all. While everyone has different tastes and responses to art styles, when trying to get an inexperienced player into a game, it's important to consider not only what kind of style is most appealing to them, but also what will communicate information to them in the most easily understandable way. Lastly, I think games that have an optional co-op feature can be incredibly helpful to new players. Through these sorts of modes, they can pick up on various things that someone with more experience does while playing and implement it into the way they play. It's a far better teaching tool than standing over their shoulder and just telling them what to do. My wife and I ended up playing a fair bit of Animal Crossing together, and while I don't think that game does a great job with local co-op, having to stay within the same screen ended up teaching her a lot about how I play. So yeah, look, what I'm trying to say, if it hasn't become obvious already, is that Animal Crossing New Horizons is the perfect entry point into gaming for someone with similar tastes as my wife. At this point, she has put more time into New Horizons than all of the other games she's played throughout the series combined. And unlike any other title, she's continued to play it even when I wasn't around to watch. So I figured instead of trying to overanalyze why that is any more than I already have, I'd just ask her. So why do you think you've played Animal Crossing more than any other game so far?
I think because everybody likes Animal Crossing, everyone's playing it, and it strangely enough makes me feel like I'm a part of this exciting thing that's happening. And that's what makes it fun. And it makes me spend apparently more than 50 hours playing it. 60. Great.
And speaking of segues, wires, am I right? As someone who constantly listens to stuff, it's really nice not to be tethered to a device all the time. And this video's sponsor, Raycon, provides just that. Raycon makes high quality wireless earbuds that sound as great as other premium brands, but start at about half the price. Beyond just sounding good, they're also really comfortable, to the point where I almost always forget when I'm wearing them. And if you're the type of person who likes to exercise or just shake your head around a lot, mine have never fallen out of my ear, which is great. Their latest model, the Everyday E25 earbuds, are awesome. They have 6 hours of playtime, seamless Bluetooth pairing, tons of bass, a more compact design that gives a nice noise isolating fit, and they come in new fun colors. If you click the link in the description, you can get 15% off your order. All in all, Raycon makes great earbuds that I use all the time. So if you're in the market, you should definitely check out Raycon because they make an awesome pair. Anyway, thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring this video. For all of you still watching, I appreciate you very, very much. More stuff is on the way, so keep an eye out. So yeah, I hope you have a great day and or night, and I'll see you in the next one.
Do you ever game so hard that it hurts? What? I'm being serious! My thumbs hurt! Like, genuinely! Like, I'm not kidding! Can you